This is Dr. Bafano, and this is my series on Middle East politics. This is the ninth lecture. In this lecture today, we're going to talk about the emergence of social movements in the Middle East in the late 19th century, specifically movements that supported liberalism, democracy. So we're going to try to understand what are social movements, how they emerged, and what impact did they have on the politics of the region. So first, I'm just going to share my PowerPoint screen with you. Let me just start the slideshow here. All right, so in order to really understand this lecture, I do highly recommend watching those previous lectures because I talk a lot about this concept of modernization and what it is. So some of the concepts I use here are building off previous talks that I gave. So make sure to do that before watching this lecture. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to define social movements, and we're going to try to understand the factors that cause their emergence. And you should be very familiar with social movements. So if you've ever heard of the civil rights movement, for example, that is a great example of a social movement. And specifically, we're going to look into the different factors that led to the emergence of these movements in the Middle East. So what economic, political, and cultural factors led to the creation of protest movements and new types of organizations that were very new to the Middle East? So we're going to talk about that. And specifically, we're going to look at a very unique type of social movement, liberalism. So we're going to understand what it is and what impact it had on the Ottoman Empire specifically during this time period. So long before the 20th century, liberalism impacted this region, not only through European imperialism, but through the diffusion of ideas coming from the European continent. So first things first, what exactly is a social movement? Well, it's a loose network of individuals and organizations. Okay, so these individuals can be journalists, academics, they can be, in today's world, podcasters, right? And they could be organizations, right? Such as labor unions, political parties. They can consist of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They're loose networks of individuals and organizations that operate outside the control of the state, meaning they're not controlled by the governments. They operate within civil society, and they have a specific purpose. They seek to influence the political system. Okay, whether directly through things like lobbying or indirectly through influencing popular discourse. So they have to be political in nature, right? So we wouldn't consider, for example, a baseball league to be a social movement. Yes, baseball leagues operate outside the control of the state, but they're not trying to transform the political system. So when you think of a social movement, you think of the civil rights movement, a movement of individuals and groups that try to end segregation in the Jim Crow South in the United States, for example. Now, why do social movements emerge? Well, they're modern phenomena, right? So we don't find social movements in the medieval era in Europe, nor do we find it during the days of the Arab caliphates in the Middle East, right? Or during the times of the Prophet Muhammad. Instead, social movements are very new. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, social movements, they consist of tens of thousands of people operating across large areas, right? Trying to change the governments. And thus they need a lot of resources. They require material resources, such as, for example, access to modern technology, radio, television, telephones, right? The internet today can be used to spread ideas across large distances. And the first social movements made use of newspapers. Now, they also require as well human resources, skilled labor. You need a literate population that can be able to read newspapers, for example. You need to have skilled activists that can mobilize resources and form new types of organizations. And they tend to work best in urban areas. In fact, the first social movements, they tend to emerge in cities, right? So the French Revolution, for example, was Paris that was at the epicenter of the revolution itself. So cities and social movements tend to go hand in hand. So you need access to a lot of resources. So we tend to find that social movement activists come from the middle class as well as the upper classes. They tend to have at least some wealth. Number two, political opportunities, right? So social movements can form outside of the state if the state doesn't allow them to form. So if you're living under a totalitarian regime, such as North Korea, for example, today, you're not going to be able to form a social movement. There needs to be at least some space outside of state control to mobilize and organize. So it's much easier in a democracy, of course, to mobilize. But if you're in a relatively weak authoritarian regime that can't control its population or is experiencing a crisis, this can give the opportunity for social movements to mobilize. And so when you think of like the civil rights movement, right, slavery and Jim Crow segregation, this existed for centuries, right? Slavery existed from the early 1600s in what is now the United States up until 1865. And then you had Jim Crow segregation up until the 1960s. So why didn't a civil rights movement emerge until the 1950s and 60s? Well, it was because of a couple of important factors, one of which was the migration of poor African American individuals out of the Jim Crow South into cities in the North, such as New York, Chicago, and this urbanization by the Black community leaving this oppressive Jim Crow South, it gave access to more resources for the Black community, and it gave them greater space to mobilize, right? So you need resources and you need political opportunities in order to be able to mobilize many people. Now, another important aspect of this as well is that social movements, in order to mobilize tens of thousands of people, they promote what are called ideological frames. What an ideology is, it's something that promotes a political solution to problems that exist, a systematic solution. They identify grievances or problems and they promote political solutions. And in many ways, ideologies are very modern because they promote this idea that systematic change is possible. You see, social movements are seeking to either change the status quo or oppose social movements that are trying to change the status quo, right? So they involve change. And so modern identities, modern ideologies, they tend to promote this idea, right, that change is possible. And so thus ideological frames are important. And in the process, social movements as well usually try to promote a common identity, right? So when you think of the civil rights movement, these organizations identified discrimination, racial discrimination, and segregation as a massive problem, and they promoted the end of segregation, political mobilization against it, protests, so on and so forth. It's the solution to this. And the common identity was uniting people around an African American identity, as well as a form of a American identity that was multicultural, right? That treated white and Black individuals as equals. So social movements, they promote identities, causes, and solutions. Now, in order to disrupt the status quo, social movements have developed a number of different tactics. Okay. Some of these tactics are what are called insider strategies. Sometimes they'll try to, for example, lobby state officials, directly contact state officials to convince them to make changes, giving them phone calls, sending them letters, perhaps, even engaging in protests right outside their offices. They try to communicate with them directly. Now, in other cases, social movements also try to rely on what are called outsider tactics. This is when they try to change the general culture so that in the long term, this will then indirectly put pressure on state officials. So engaging in protests to capture the attention of the media, giving interviews with journalists or writing articles themselves, setting up newspapers. Also, sometimes as well, establishing social services and charity networks to win the population over. And so these are what we call outsider tactics. And usually social movements will use a mix of these strategies. And so in the past couple of centuries, with the emergence of modernity, we have seen social movements emerge across the globe. And of course, it is modern in nature, right? These movements tend to be urbanized, literate. They tend to use mass media in order to get the message out there. And last but not least, these movements can operate at different levels, right? They can operate at the city level, the regional, the level of the nation, or even transnationally across borders. And they can promote a great variety of different causes. They could promote liberalism, communism, maybe they promote the rights of racial minorities or the LGBTQ community. They could be anti-imperialism. So their causes can vary greatly, but they can operate at many different levels, including across countries. And so I just put this example of social movement activity that exists today. Recently, for example, you might have seen these kind of pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli protests in the United States, and this video just kind of goes in it. So you could watch that and think to yourself, like, how does this reflect a social movement? What tactics are being used here? So highly recommend checking out the video there. So we know what social movements are. So when did they emerge in the Middle East and why? Well, they're a modern phenomenon, right? So we've already talked a lot about modernity and its emergence in the Middle East. And social movements themselves emerged in the mid to late 19th century, the 1800s. And it's not a coincidence. In our previous lectures on this unit on modernization, we talked about a couple of different pathways in terms of how modernization has impacted the region. So, for example, we talked about defensive developmentalism. This is when the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, the Shahs of the Qajar Empire, they tried to make reforms in response to the emergence of modern Europe to prevent their conquest, right? To defend their sovereignty, investing in modernization, right? Building railways and new universities, investing in science and a new military, investing in agricultural development and even attempts at industry, right? And we also see as well through European imperialism another pathway through modernity. We talked about the conquest of Algeria by the French in 1830 and the imperialism in Egypt by the British and the building of the Suez Canal. And what this did in a very uneven way was lead to various aspects of modernization. And so what's going to happen in the Middle East because of all this is you're going to start to see growing urbanization and literacy from the 1800s to the 1900s. Cities are going to grow. The number of people that can read and write are going to grow. And new technologies that enable the growth of a literate culture, such as the printing press and libraries, the printing of books, this is going to emerge and become very important. Now, other aspects that are important to social movements here deal with improvements in travel and communications, right? I can't form a nationwide or a transnational social movement unless I can communicate easily and travel across borders, right? So the development of railways, the telegraph, and steamships, this enables social movement activists to communicate across large distances. And this is what took place during this era. And so as a consequence, what we start to see emerge are the first newspapers. Now, Napoleon, back in 1798, the French introduced the printing press into the Middle East. And it's going to be under Muhammad Ali, who ruled Egypt as the Ottoman governor and brought about those modernization reforms. He introduces the first newspaper in 1828. And then the Ottoman Empire has its first newspaper in 1831 in Istanbul. In Qajar, Iran, it's 1837, Tunisia, 1860, and so on and so forth, right? So we see the spread of this literate newspaper culture across the region. And in the process, as I said, human capital is important. You need human resources. Because of the growth in education, we see the emergence of this very new middle class, bourgeoisie of, well-educated engineers, educated in the sciences. We see lawyers. Remember, so in the 1850s, the Ottoman Empire introduced a French-style legal system, right? So they needed Western-trained lawyers. We see the emergence of doctors, right? So Muhammad Ali introduced, European-style hospitals during his reign. We see the emergence of teachers, new universities like the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. We see the emergence of new well-educated bureaucrats and military officers, as well as students emerge. And these people are going to be very much part of this middle class culture that is going to be swayed and influenced by ideologies such as liberalism. And this is going to enable the formation of what we call civil society organizations that are going to become the bedrock of social movements. So when you think of, for example, like clubs, for example, book clubs, academic clubs, student unions on campuses, secret societies forming underground to promote liberal reforms, the emergence of the first political parties and labor unions in the region. This is going to start to take place during this era. And just to show you some of these trends, urbanization, it's a modern phenomenon here. So we see urbanization take off in the 1800s. Western countries like the UK and the United States did so first, but the rest of the world's going to catch up. And today, over 50% of the population in the Middle East lives in cities, and the growth started in the late 19th century, and just in terms of urbanization. And you can see these photos and images just to kind of bring this alive for all of you. So on the left here, we have, a new part of Cairo built by the British called Heliopolis. And notice this tramway that was built in Cairo, making travel across the city much easier. And to the right here, we have Istanbul. So during the Tanzimat reforms, modern infrastructure was built, railways, and their cities. We see the emergence of trams, right, being built here. And later, of course, automobiles are going to emerge in the early 20th century. And with that as well, modern forms of communication and art and culture are going to influence this region. So, for example, I talked about Ismail, the ruler Ismail in Egypt, in the 1860s and 70s, built a whole new capital in Cairo, a whole new center of the city, the downtown area that was modeled off of Paris. And one of the squares that's found there is Opera Plaza, where an opera house was built, right? And so you get these very large squares with these coffee houses, and these bookstores start to emerge. And on top of that as well, these cities were built for mass communication as well as transportation. The modern ports were built in cities such as Algiers under French rule. And so we see these great changes in the cities. And, here, of course, with the Suez Canal to the right, so we get these 3 new cities built on the canal. Here in Istanbul, a modern port gets built, more trade is taking place. And so thus, this is what enables the emergence of social movements. And we also see as well rising rates of education. This is looking at world literacy rates at the bottom. And you can see here at the beginning of the 18th century, only about 10% of the world's population was literate. And today, over 80% are now literate. And on top of that as well, we see these growths in the Middle East starting in the late 19th century, right? So lots of changes happened. And this is going to then enable really a re-emergence of new and innovative intellectual activity in the Arab world and the Islamic world more generally. Really the first big movement since the golden age of Islam. And in the Arab world, this was known as the Nahda, or the Renaissance. And so what the Nahda was this intellectual revival that was due to the emergence of social movements and intellectual activity in the late 1800s. And it was led, this movement, by this new emerging class, this middle class of well-educated intellectuals that were beginning to promote reforms and change in their societies, that were open because of their influence and their dealings with the West, right? Many students were studying abroad and coming back with new ideas. And of course, in order to learn from Europe and other civilizations, mass translation took place. This is just like during the golden age of Islam, where books on European science and literature, they begin to be translated into Arabic as well as other languages in the Middle East, right? Places like the American University in Beirut, the American University in Cairo are going to be hubs for this. And just like the golden age of Islam, it's not just going to be Muslims that were involved in this. It was also Christian and Jewish intellectuals, as well as a lot of study abroad students from Europe that are going to participate in this activity. And what emerges out of this, right? So let's imagine you're intellectuals trying to communicate across the Ottoman Empire, your Arab intellectuals, for example. Well, it's easier to communicate when you have a written standard language. You can't read newspapers unless you're speaking the same language. Now, at the time, even though Arabic had spread across many parts of the Middle East due to the Islamic conquests by Muhammad's successors, there was no standard written Arabic language, and how Arabic was written differed from place to place and region to region. And it had a lot of different words and vocabulary mixed into it from other languages. Well, what the Arab intellectuals of this period wanted to do was to standardize the Arabic language so that everybody in the Arabic world could read it. And so this led to the emergence of what is called modern standard Arabic, a single written Arabic language that could foster mass communication, right? So if you're in a country that's speaking dozens of languages, it is tough to have a cohesive social movement. But if you're all speaking the same language, communication becomes easier. And so we call this MSA, Modern Standard Arabic. If you ever learn Arabic, the written language is different from the spoken dialects, right? So there's a single written language today because of this. And with that, we begin to see the spread of European mediums of novels, plays, opera, right? Poetry, works of history, they begin to be translated into the Arabic language, and thus fostering the transmission of ideas from Europe to the Middle East. And we begin as well to see a revival of Arabic literature from the Golden Age of Islam. Now, this is an important point. The activists of the Arab Renaissance, while they were promoting change, right, they wanted to promote change within their political systems, introduce modernization into the Middle East. They also didn't want to just totally get rid of the past. Remember, if you're a social movement, it's not a really good idea to inspire people by saying, hey, your traditions are crap and you need to do this in order to make changes. You do need to inspire pride in people's identity. Their identity is Arabs, their identity is Muslims, their identity is Turks or Persians. And so thus, using the Golden Age of Islam is a way to say, hey, look, we had this great period in our history, right? We have a past of this great intellectual tradition. We have a great past of art, architecture, and music. We shouldn't let all of this go, right? While we're making these modernization reforms, we should also hold to some of these things from the past, right? And of course, this is what social movements like the civil rights movement do, promoting Black pride. And so the Arab Renaissance was in part about promoting Arab pride and identity. And, we see this happen in other centers across the Middle East. So in Istanbul, the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, it was the Turkish language that experienced this renaissance. And in the Khazar Empire in Tehran, it was the Farsi language. So we see these movements emerge. And as a consequence of this, it is going to inspire political reform. Now, one of the great problems of modernization in its earliest beginnings in the 1800s in the Middle East was that it was led by these despotic sultans or European imperialists, dictators that were not interested in democratizing the Middle East. Well, this new generation of reformers from the bottom up is going to promote democratization and liberalization. Okay. And so they're going to promote modernization while still trying to keep some traditions. Now, of course, as you're going to find out, they're going to disagree on how to do so, the tactics and what ideology should we exactly promote to do this. But we're going to see vibrant intellectual activity during this era that's going to lead to a lot of changes, reforms, and political movements, including revolution. Just a couple examples of these reformers here. To the left, we have Rifa El-Tahtawi. He was a student that was sent over by Muhammad Ali to France to study at a university in Paris, became very well educated. He actually lived and witnessed the French Revolution of 1830, and he became inspired by ideas like democracy as well as other modern political ideas. And so he wrote a lot promoting educational reform. He helped set up newspapers, very active intellectually. And he was a Muslim reformer. Now, we also have an example of a Christian to the right here, Boutros el-Bustani, who was someone who also as well promoted modern reforms. He went to the American University of Beirut. He helped standardize the Arabic dictionary, and he was very much active in terms of promoting the Arab Renaissance. And so, at the heart of this was this kind of transformation of written language and translation and learning ideas from Europe through, these kind of new standardized languages like modern standard Arabic. And in fact, we see the word modern in there, right? Modern standard Arabic. And the epicenter here of this movement, where it took place, was in a place called Beirut. This is now the capital of the independent country of Lebanon, and it used to be part of this province of Greater Syria under the Ottoman Empire. So we can see where Beirut is located here. And one of the most important parts of Lebanon is called Mount Lebanon, which has a very large Christian population. It's going to be very important for our story here. Now, during the early days of the Ottoman Empire, Lebanon was, it was a relatively peripheral part of the empire. Beirut was a small town, but this is going to change in the late 19th century for a variety of reasons. In 1839, we learned from a previous lecture that the Ottoman Empire, during the Tanzimat reforms, announced religious equality in that year, declaring all the different religious groups equal. And this was under European pressure. However, just because you promote religious equality doesn't mean it's getting enforced on the ground or that the population is going to accept this. Paradoxically, by trying to promote reforms, it's going to lead to further conflict between Muslims, Christians, and other religious groups. Christians become empowered because they see their power and influence growing, and they've got these new European allies like France and Russia to support them within the empire. And Muslims, for their part, many of them see themselves as losing their power to these Christian minorities, and thus it's going to lead to some antagonism and conflict. And in fact, it's going to upset the balance of power between faiths in the region, especially as European imperialism grows. And in fact, it's in this Ottoman province of Greater Syria that has a lot of religious diversity, lots of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, so Sunni and Shia, different varieties of Christianity, all kind of bunched up together next to one another. And what we start to see is more communal conflict and violence, and it starts to escalate. And the worst of this violence took place around Mount Lebanon from 1860 to 1861. In Mount Lebanon, there were a variety of different Christian, Muslim, and as well as a religious community called the Druze. They were a religious minority in the region, very small part of the population. And in this time period, we start to see village riots and violence break out. And particularly the worst of which was between a group called the Maronite Christians, very close to the Catholics, and this community, the Druze, in which about 20,000 people were killed in the violence. And the Sultanate, the Ottomans, they struggled to put down the violence. They struggled to keep control. It just, there was, in the empire, there was a lot of instability during this time period, right? And because they couldn't contain the violence, the French stepped in. The French had close connections to the Christians in Mount Lebanon, particularly the Catholics and the Maronites, and they said, look, cut out the violence or we're going to intervene. And eventually the French do so. The French send in their troops. They pacify the region. In other words, they conquer it, right? And, and what they essentially do is they force the Ottomans to give Christians a Mount Lebanon autonomy. And a Christian governor is announced, and it becomes its own province as a result of this. This is also why Lebanon would later become a separate country after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is a political opportunity, remember that word, of great importance. Because of this, Beirut is going to really become this very active center of trade and cultural exchange, as well as social movement activity. It's where a lot of ideas are going to enter into the Middle East. In fact, Beirut is going to become known as the Paris of the Middle East after this, and a place of major social movement activity, such as protests and the publishing of all sorts of new works in various languages, including Arabic, right? And so we see here, the American University in Beirut just becomes this kind of symbol of great change. In fact, this university was established by American Protestants, missionaries that came to Lebanon in the late 19th century. And this is where the Arabic language was standardized. So here we see this kind of Western influence creeping in. And, of course, this cultural exchange, by the way, wasn't just one-sided. We're going to see a lot of works, from Arabic culture enter the Western world. So you probably have heard of 1001 Nights before. It's this famous, story about during the days of the Ottoman Sultan, there was this corrupt sultan who used to kill his entertainers if they didn't perform well. And one day he brings in this slave woman to tell him a story so that he could get to sleep. And she has to tell a really good story, so she kind of panics. But eventually she tells him a good story, and night after night, she gives them all these new stories to the Sultan. And if you've ever seen, for example, the Disney movie Aladdin, that's a story that was based off one of the things we find in 1001 Nights. So we see a lot of cultural exchange during this time period. All right, so from all of this, we see the emergence, the entering of the region of liberalism. Now, what exactly is liberalism? Well, it's support for democracy. And by democracy, I mean free and fair elections for a democratically elected legislative and executive body. And of course, what comes with that is freedom, right? Civil liberties, the right to speak freely, and political rights. They promote popular participation in politics, right? And this means the state has to allow freedom of religion and speech and the freedom to assemble and protest. And this ideology, it comes into the Middle East in the late 19th century because of all these activities. Now, why did liberalism become popular? Well, for one, they saw that the absolute monarchs of the region, that the reforms that they were trying to make with defensive developmentalism wasn't enough, right? These monarchs were still absolute monarchs. They didn't share power. They still engaged in corruption. A lot of their attempts at development failed. In fact, they took out too many loans from Europeans. A lot of that money was used on grandiose projects like building palaces. We saw the case with Ismail, right? How this backfired on him during his reign in Egypt, last lecture. So that was part of the grievances these liberals had. But another grievance they had was the despotism of Europeans and the hypocrisy. So while France in the late 1800s was being ruled as a democracy, Algeria wasn't. Algeria was being ruled by these French settlers, and the Arab Muslims there didn't have a say in politics. And of course, in Egypt, the British were propping up a monarchy that wasn't sharing power with the people. So they had these grievances, and what they wanted, their solutions, was democratization. They wanted the sultans to open up to free and fair elections and representative government. They promoted constitutional monarchies, right? So this idea of, the monarchs are an absolute, they have to share power. And so we get with this democratic rhetoric, the promotion of democracy. And what's interesting is they use Arabic tradition and Arabic language to do this. So to give you a great example, the term mejlis is the Arabic word for legislator. Now, back during the days of the Arabian Peninsula before Islam came, the Arab tribes used to have this tradition of consensus where the tribal leaders would sit down and talk about their problems. That is what is called a mejlis. Okay, and so this tradition of consensus kind of existed with these tribes. And if you remember, during the first caliphate, the first successors to Muhammad, those first four successors, the Rashidun, they had this tradition of consensus where they would talk through their problems as opposed to having an absolute monarchy. So they were trying to really use these old traditions to say, hey, look, we have these traditions in the Arabic world and the Islamic world. They're already there. And of course, while the Rashidun Caliphate was not like a democracy like we know today, there was that tradition of talking about problems and consensus. And so they used Arabic tradition to defend modern reforms. This is what good social movements are very good at doing. They use the ideas that already exist to promote reforms. So Martin Luther King, for example, he used Thomas Jefferson's tradition of liberalism and freedom and equality within the Declaration of Independence to justify freedom and equality for Black individuals as well. So you take old ideas and you make them new. And part of this as well meant we need to write down constitutions, right? We needed written laws that regulate what the government can and cannot do and limit the powers of the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, the shahs of Iran, right, the Qajars. And so thus you see this constitutional movement emerge. Now, this movement wasn't completely united on all issues. Some of these movement activists were just moderate reformers, others were radicals. Some as well were secularists that wanted the separation of church and state. And others were what we call Islamists, who I'm going to talk about next lecture, who wanted to mix religion and politics. So there were divides amongst these liberals. And as you're going to find out as well, not all social movements in the region are going to support democracy. Many Islamists don't support democratization. Now, who are these liberal reformers that emerged? Well, we're going to talk about a movement called the Young Ottomans, one of the most important of this era in the late 19th century, led by these two middle-class intellectuals, Namik Kemal and Ibrahim Senasi, who, spent a lot of time abroad in Europe. And in fact, they're going to spend some time in exile because of their political activities. They were bourgeois, middle-class, well-educated. You could see by the way they dress, right, imitating European styles here. And they're going to form this underground movement called the Young Ottomans, a liberal political movement. And we're going to see a lot of in the titles, a lot of these movements, young, right? Young indicates like young students, the new emerging class of intellectuals, new modernization, right? And they formed as a secret liberal organization in Istanbul in 1865. And so this is in the middle of the Tanzimat reforms. This group felt like it wasn't going far enough, that the sultans needed to make greater changes. And they started promoting their rhetoric underground secretly. They started forming a lot of these student clubs and book clubs, talking behind closed doors. And in fact, even some of the younger members of the sultan's family are going to become swayed by this, as are some young military officers within the Turkish military. And 2 years later, following the growth of the movement, they come public for the first time. In 1867, they issue a petition to the Sultan for liberal reforms. And suddenly, their movement is growing. They start to protest. They start to form numerous newspapers, one of which was called Hurriyet, which means freedom in Arabic, and Alum, which means science. They had publications in both Turkish and Arabic. And, it's freedom, right? Very liberal concept. Science refers to modernity. And so these newspapers promoted articles, right, promoting liberalism extensively, as well as critiquing the Sultan's policies, as well as the Europeans in places like Algeria. Now, eventually, as their movement started to gain steam, they suddenly became a threat. And so Sultan Abdulaziz, when he came into power, he's going to start cracking down on this movement. And he's going to start sending some of these individuals to prison. Others are going to flee into exile. But the movement is still going to pick up steam underground as these movements are going to continue building secret societies. And the opportunity these groups are going to have to mobilize and form a mass protest movement was the economic crisis, a global economic crisis of 1873. This was the Great Depression before the Great Depression of the 1930s that you're probably more familiar with. This crisis was caused by over-speculation in new industrial technology like railways. Banks were giving out too many loans. Some of the new businesses failed. There was a global economic crisis. And when the European banks had less money to give out, it meant the Ottoman sultans, they and other rulers of the region had less money to borrow. Right. And so thus we see this economic crisis spread throughout the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere. In fact, it's during this crisis that Ismail in Egypt, we learned about this last lecture, was forced to declare bankruptcy. Right. And then suddenly the British and French take over his cabinet. And this leads to the Urabi Revolt and then the British imperialism in Egypt. Well, we see a similar breakdown and stability in the Ottoman Empire here. We start to see secessionist movements emerge in the Balkans. That's, in the area of Greece and former Yugoslavia, where Serbia is. And at the time ruled by the Ottoman Empire, we start to see these separatist movements emerge, led by these different nationalist groups. And with all this instability and protests, Sultan Abdulaziz in 1876 is overthrown by his own military in a coup. These supporters of the young Ottomans are going to come into power. And what they do is they enact the Ottoman Empire's first constitution of 1876, a momentous moment where, modeling off the old school constitutional monarchy of Britain that existed back in the 17th century, they're going to build what is essentially a constitutional monarchy. They're going to create a legislature, a parliament that was a bicameral legislature, which means two houses. They're going to have elections, one in which only those with wealth and land and education could vote, but elections nonetheless with representatives. And the executive branch is still going to be controlled by the Sultan, but his power is no longer unlimited. The power is limited by the new legislature and a new court system, okay? And so the rule of law is supposed to apply in this new system. The Sultan can't just raise taxes whenever he wants, okay? He has to only enforce laws created by parliaments. So momentous, this is huge in the region. And so, on top of it as well, Sultan Abdulaziz, not trusted, he is sidelined from power, and a member of his family, Abdulhamid II, becomes the new sultan. Someone that the young Ottomans could be someone that they could control and that was pliable, right? So we have this kind of regime change here that takes place. And so if you remember from that lecture I gave on modernization, right? And I told you how today legislature is very common in the region. Well, this was the first big one in the Ottoman Empire, right? So the first big one in Istanbul gets formed here. So very momentous moment. Now, as you're going to see, though, in my next lecture, social movements don't emerge in a vacuum. In response to this, the opponents of democratization, both among the Sultan's family as well as within civil society, particularly by certain reactionary Islamists, are going to oppose this movement. We'll talk all about that next lecture and how those movements impacted the region. So I'll see you guys next lecture.